made us think, with a mass that gave us pause for reflection. A huge thank you to everyone who participated in that. We're expecting even more people today, so please welcome them. We've got some of them sitting up on the second floor, but we're absolutely delighted to have all of you here. Let me tell you about the panelists for this session. I'll start with Dr. Samuel Torres. He's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. His doctorate is in educational leadership for social justice. His background in research first brought him to NABS in the role of Director of Research and Programs. His collaborations, including with the U.S. Department of the Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, have been key in his work in the areas of decolonizing fixed knowledge systems, working in communities to promote indigenous futures. Sam's focus on accountability has been instrumental in raising awareness and changing systems and providing families with answers. My friend Monique Maddox lives in Edina, Minnesota, and she is active at Our Lady of Grace, where she serves as a trustee. She is the founder and owner of Macrame Technologies, an IT consulting firm that specializes in cybersecurity threat and data risk management. In 2016, she was reading an article in the New York Times about the slaves that the Jesuits owned at Georgetown University. As she continued to read, there was a picture that she said sent chills down her arms. A man she recognized in the cemetery in her hometown in Louisiana in front of her father's grave. She followed the article to the link and discovered that she was a living descendant of those slave families. That has led her to work closely with the leadership at Georgetown and with the Jesuit provincials, along with the other descendants. In the work of truth and reparations, she currently serves as board chair and CEO of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. Most Reverend Shelton Fabb of Arch of Louisville is here. We're always happy to have him with us in Minneapolis. His homily yesterday at the opening Mass was a reflection that brought the topics of our first day together beautifully. He was appointed Archbishop of Louisville in 2022, following previous appointments that included New Orleans, where he helped rebuild the archdiocese after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina. He served as the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops chair and with the ad hoc committee against racism, and led the writing of Open Wide Our Hearts, The Enduring Call to Love, the pastoral letter on racism. Last up is our moderator, my friend, Dr. Yahiro Williams, who leads the Racial Justice Initiative here at the University of St. Thomas. He serves as chair and professor of history. His research interests include a range of African American history topics, including legal history, urban history, and 20th century American history. He's a historian and a storyteller. Yahiro is a frequent contributor and commentator on programs, and you may have seen him on PBS, the History Channel, CNN. Among the many things I appreciate about Yahiro is how he informs and challenges my partial perspective. I can see racial injustice when we're on the fourth floor with our law students, when I'm at the Basilica with Janice Anderson and the EDI work, when we're in Stillwater with the men in the restorative justice course at that correctional facility. But the rest of the time, when I hear Yahiro talk about how the food that built America, his book titled Jack, the story of Jackie Robinson in Major League Baseball, it opens what I see, and I appreciate that. During the trials that followed the killing of George Floyd, his media commentary brought an important perspective to those of us who live in Minneapolis and were indeed reeling. A quick add-on, Yahiro is a Renaissance man. He is a DJ. He has workouts that would kill me. He has takes Portuguese language lessons and salsa lessons. So he is indeed a Tommy treasure. Please welcome Yahiro.
Thank you, Julie. Hola todos. Julie said I spoke Portuguese. I had to make sure that I lived up to that. I'm going to ask if we can put our PowerPoint up. We have a very challenging presentation for you today. And before we begin, I want to be clear that your well-being is very important to us. So as we welcome those who are joining us online, I also want to reiterate that this presentation addresses topics related to racial harms, racism, and discriminatory experiences. For that reason, some of the content that we share today, I'm not going to say maybe, will be distressing or triggering to some individuals who have experienced racial trauma or are sensitive to discussions about racism, discrimination, and prejudice. The intention of this presentation is to create awareness, foster understanding, and most importantly, to promote change. We encourage self-care and discretion while engaging with this material. If you find the content overwhelming, please consider reaching out to a support person or mental health professional for assistance. Your well-being is important to us, and of course, if you need to step out for a few minutes, we certainly understand. And again, want to make sure that you understand that this is a space that you can do that. Having said that, before we get to our panelists today, and I don't want anyone to think that I'm taking prerogative as a St. Thomas professor, I was asked to provide some foundation for our conversation. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes with you, just kind of setting the table in some sense for what we're going to talk about today in terms of this historical harms presentation. And I want to begin with some conventional wisdom from James Baldwin, who was famous for saying, the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way you look at reality, then you can change it. What we hope to do in the roughly hour and a half that we have with you today is alter the way that we think about racial harm and racial justice and the responsibility of the church. And the reason that's important is because, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King once said, shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. That, of course, all of our intentions in our heart is in the right place, but ultimately, if that doesn't move us to action, then what we commit is unfinished business. I think that's important because when we talk about this with regard to Americans in particular, part of the challenge with us as Americans is that at the end of the day, what always frustrates efforts at achieving real and lasting change in this country is our desire for a tragedy with a happy ending. I'm sharing that with you in a way that William Dean Howells once gave advice to Edith Wharton as she was embarking on her literary career, where he said to her, Edith, if you want to be successful in this business, understand this one truth about the American people. What they always want is a tragedy with a happy ending. We have a sitcom understanding of our history. We want everything wrapped up in 30 minutes. We want to believe that some piece of legislation or some charismatic leader has moved us to the next level, and so we all are then allowed to get off the exit ramp and assume that nothing remains to be done. Our history is a testament to this. The Civil War and Reconstruction, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Revolution is done, not quite. Civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. Our work is done, not quite. In fact, I want to begin with you today by talking about why this desire for comfort is so dangerous, by talking about my new book, More Than a Dream. In 1963, August 28th represents the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. John Lewis, who passed away in 2020, and in his final letter to the American people, argued that together we can redeem the soul of America, experienced what it feels like when people don't want to honestly face the truth of our past. In 1963 at the March on Washington. He was the youngest speaker, and the Kennedy administration, in order to sign off on the march in the first place, wanted A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King and the other leaders of the march to assure him there'd be no violence. But the Kennedy administration also wanted to take a look at the speeches beforehand, and the person who got that responsibility was Archbishop Patrick O'Boyle. When Archbishop O'Boyle read John Lewis's speech, he went to A. Philip Randolph and he said, I will not deliver the invocation if this speech is delivered in the way that it has been written. And the other speakers weren't as disturbed by what Lewis had to say because they understood that the wound that produced the narrative in that moment, that it compelled people to go to Washington, D.C., was so great that John Lewis needed to express it in that level of clarity and with that same level of intensity and without that censorship. Because it's difficult for us to see and appreciate when we are whitewashing, homogenizing, making comfortable, uncomfortable truths. Doesn't mean we have to shame and blame people, but the reality is that we have to deal with the truth in its unedited version. Otherwise, we get the sitcom understanding. I share that with you because in a lot of ways, as Curtis DeYoung has argued, and I love this quote from him, reconciliation occurs between equals, and you don't have equals if my comfort means that we can't tell the truth about what got us in this space to begin with. It was such an incredible panel yesterday at the end of the day with my colleague Amy Levad and others talking about this from the perspective of reconciliation and why we have to be very careful in the way that we define reconciliation. I am a big proponent of the importance of historical recovery because without historical recovery, without a foundation of what happened, we can't talk about getting beyond what happened. I want to be very clear in sharing that with you, that in a lot of ways, when we think about yesterday's panel, one of the things that I loved at the very end was this conversation about representations of Christ. And if it would make a difference, I love this at the very end yesterday, if the representations of Christ and the saints and the Madonna that we saw were different, if it would somehow alter, ha-ha, Father Brian Massengale has spoken to this, I think, beautifully, eloquently, when he argued, when he argued, for most of our bishops, and I would argue for most of us, they don't have sustained interactions with persons of color who can acquaint them with the basic facts of life and reality. On some level, they don't want to articulate that we live in a world that privileges white lives because if they face that fact, that reality, then they're called to change it. I think that's something that people don't want to do. I think what they also don't want to do is something I have to talk to folks about when I talk about the March on Washington and remind them that just 6 weeks after the March on Washington, 4 little girls were killed in the 16th Baptist Church on a Sunday morning. And that was the response to the nonviolent call for change that Dr. King and others offered on August 28, 1963. But I want to remind people that white Christians and black Christians in separate churches stood on separate sides of picket lines over the issue of racism because racism isn't just a sin, racism is idolatry. Because when white comes before Christian, there's no question of what you privilege and what you worship first. What's first in that articulation? In fact, as much as I love Catholic social teaching, and I think Catholic social teaching is a tool for dealing with these issues, it's important for us to recognize that Catholic social teaching is often, sometimes talked about in ways that privileges white body supremacy. We say each person is sacred, white being first among equals. Well, there's no first among equals, there's simply equals. See, it's going to be uncomfortable today. Y'all very quiet. That's okay with me. Number 2, each person is social. All people have rights and responsibilities. We care for the people who are poor and vulnerable. Workers have rights. Workers have dignity. Solidarity is our call. We care for creation. But we can't do those things without dealing with the ways in which, and Professor Torres will speak to this today, we have denied the very people who were here first and embodied this space the very right to their existence as human beings. We can't say it and not mean it and talk about it in ways that call us to deal, to grapple, to interrogate the history. And then say, when do we get to the good part where we all say we're sorry and we move on? Just 2 more minutes with you here. My good friend Jim Bear Jacobs loves to say that part of the problem in this is that whiteness needs to be innocent. In fact, Jim Bear puts it this way: we need to face and address our desire, or this is actually me, for this tragedy with a happy ending and replace it with a will and desire to take on the difficult work. And part of that innocence narrative I want to share with you, and this will be part of Professor Torres's talk today. I just pulled this today because there's so much conversation about, things like critical race theory, and there's pushback against the teaching of substantive American history. And I want to talk about why that history is important. This is from nebraskastudies.org. This is a educational academic site that promotes the history of Nebraska. Now, I want to read this to you because it's talking about William Pratt, who is one of the chief architects of the Indian schools, as they were called. And it's explaining William Pratt's motivation. And they write on this website, Pratt's solution was to take Indians off of the reservation and integrate them into white society through education. His intentions were probably good, although he often characterized his approach in stark terms. I believe in immersing the Indians in our civilization, and when we get them under, holding them there until they are thoroughly soaked. Kill the Indian and save the man. How in the heck are those intentions good? We need to talk about this, y'all, because I want to be clear that in the way that that history is framed, it privileges Pratt's innocence over the harm that was inflicted on the people who suffered as a result of having their language, their culture, their customs robbed. And I want to be clear in saying that to you, that no land acknowledgement in the world makes up for that harm. Those good words are about us, about privileging our comfort. I want to share with you Chief Justice Joseph from 1879, where I think he offers a historical response to land acknowledgments that don't go beyond the acknowledging, that don't call us to action beyond that, where he said, listen, words, this is 1879, do not pay for my dead people. They do not pay for my country now overrun by white men. They do not protect my father's grave. They do not pay for all my horses and cattle. Good words will not give me back my children. Good words will not give my people good health and stop them from dying. Good words will not get my people a home where they can live in peace and take care of themselves. I'm tired of talk that comes to nothing. Spent a lot of time talking about the Indian schools with you in particular. I'm going to skip that for just a second. And I just want to establish for a moment why this is so important in our contemporary moment, because I think about Bradley Onishi's book, Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next, to remind people, and I'm going to just give you Romans here, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creepy things. If that's not a description of the Ku Klux Klan and some of those costumes I saw on January 6th, I don't know what is. Because they're privileging white over Christian. The man over the message. And I will go back to Pratt for a minute, and when you say Indian schools and those images of those young children dressed up as in white respectability cloaks is idolatry, is a sin. So I want to conclude today, and then I'll turn it over to each member of our panel to give some opening remarks, by saying if you take nothing from this panel, we have to practice or think about the difference between bearing whiteness instead of bearing witness. I'm going to say that again. Y'all are very quiet today. We need to think about the difference between bearing whiteness and bearing witness, because the church has been, in a lot of ways, even our conversations about reconciliation have been about bearing whiteness, about innocence, about who's guilty and who's not, about the work that we do. I'll give you a good example of this. There's so many people who run around talking about, and I want to be clear, and this is a minority opinion, but oh well. We've got to change the name of this building in our community because it represents harm and injustice. But did you ask the people who lived in the community what the echoes or the scars of that injustice are on them and what they'd like to be changed? Because the land acknowledgement is about our comfort, about our privilege in deciding what constitutes reconciliation, restitution. I was at a university 4.5 years ago, and they were having this uncomfortable conversation about these issues. And a young woman stood up in the middle of a presentation and said, I don't know why we're spending so much time talking about whether we're going to change the name of this building when we have less than 4% students of color at our institution. We should be more concerned with increasing the numbers of students of color at our institution. And now in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision in Fair versus Harvard this summer, we should be thinking creatively about how to make sure that restorative justice practices in reducing racial harm and trauma means creating spaces where people no longer have the opportunity to say, as Father Massengale spoke to, that, well, I don't see him here and that's okay because that's some history and some past and something that I don't have to deal with. I just live in the present, and oh well, we read the land acknowledgement, and that's just fine in terms of what my commitment to justice has to be. Conclude with you on this note. I love that image. Some people can't breathe, some people can't see. Psalms, their idols are silver and gold, their work of hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. Eyes, but they do not see. They have ears, but they do not hear. Noses, but they do not smell. They have hands, but they do not feel. Feet, but they do not walk. And they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them, so do all who trust in them. In this moment, my message to you before I ask Dr. Torres first to stand up and share with you his perspective is to recognize that if we don't see, and we don't speak, and we don't stand, and we don't act, and we're not uncomfortable in that process, then what we will build in this moment is another idol to indifference. What they'll say about us a generation from now is what we say about the civil rights generation, unfinished revolution. We had the opportunity, we had the means, we had the insight, but we lacked the will because we just didn't want to be uncomfortable. Because we just didn't want to be uncomfortable. Comfort is an impediment to justice in the same way that indifference invites a continuation of the harms that we associate with racial trauma in this country. I conclude with you on this note. Why did it take people 9.5 minutes to see George Floyd suffocated under the knee of Derek Chauvin to recognize the simplistic Christian value that is exemplified in Catholic social teaching and the dignity of human life, for people to rise up and finally say, oh yeah, Black lives matter. We should make a commitment to the preservation of Black life. We should do more. And why is it that 3 years later, people are ready to get off that exit ramp and go, too much, had enough, tired of hearing this. You're asking too much of me. You're asking too much of us, of our institutions, of our values. I would submit we're not asking enough. Dr. Torres, I invite you to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And I want to give thanks to all of you here today to be a part of this discussion, to open your hearts to learning, to being vulnerable, and to leaning in together as relatives. And I want to also thank the organizers for including our, being mindful and inclusive of our plant medicine relatives today for these conversations that we are going to be centering. So I'll start with just introducing myself in my language. Tonalte no yolo ikniwan nat no toka Samuel ni meshika iwan ni nawa. And what I said in Nahuatl, my traditional language, a language that I'm still reconnecting with because it was a language that I did not have the privilege and the reality of really growing up with. Settler colonialism has impacted all of us, but particularly for me, settler colonialism has impacted the way in which language and the knowledge that it is contained within it and our connection to my ancestors, our ancestors, has been transformed dramatically. And boarding schools is an enormous part of that story. So what I just shared with you was offering you some good energy for today as relatives, as well as sharing my name, Samuel Torres, and introducing myself to you as a Mexica Nahua man. I'm from Los Angeles, California, is where I was born and raised. Most of my relatives are from Zacatecas, Mexico. My family, we are Native Mexican, particularly Mexica Nahua. And I come here today to share a little bit with you about our work from the Healing Coalition, but also to contribute to a conversation about what comes next, about where we are right now, about what has happened to us as people, as relatives, as a society. And a lot of conversations are circulating today around restorative justice, of course, deservingly so, around reconciliation, around the involvement and complicity of whiteness, of Christianity, of Americanization, and deservingly so. And so I invite you to lean into this conversation to ask ourselves, when discomfort comes up, where is that discomfort coming from? And I really appreciate Dr. Williams centering the notion of when we are moving towards innocence, this is an active factor of white-bodied supremacy. And I invite you to sit with that feeling, because it's a feeling that so many of us outside of whiteness and white spaces, that we have this feeling very much all the time. And so it's one that I invite you to sit in with, to feel that discomfort, to interrogate that discomfort, and to try to understand, what do we do with that discomfort? So I'd like to just open some remarks about how we contextualize reconciliation. And so often in this work, we hear from folks, how can we reconcile? How do we get to a place of healing? How do we get to a place of restored relations? And these are very tough questions to answer succinctly and concisely, because prior to that, we have to, as Dr. Williams alluded to, confront the realities of past injustices and how those past injustices contribute to those material conditions that continue to replicate injustice. And sometimes that means that's interrogating traditions, interrogating past patterns of practice that sometimes are articulated as dogma. And so therein lies another discomfort, right? Because there is comfort in tradition. There is comfort in dogma at times. And so when we're interrogating these aspects of ourselves, of our practice, there can be some ample discomfort. And I share these words because reconciliation often is a destination that folks point to first in this work with boarding schools, in racial injustice altogether. And what is reconciliation if we don't confront those material conditions, if we don't grasp the root of injustice? Shouldn't reconciliation not only address the failure to honor treaties, but also returning land to indigenous people? Settler colonialism, aligned at times historically, we must confront with Christianity via the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny. Both structurally and epistemologically, settler colonialism have greatly fractured the premise of reconciliation given the massive social, economic, and political power asymmetry between indigenous nations and settler states. Reconciliation really can only take place when the impacts of structural and epistemological colonialism are restored and transformed. Just as healing cannot meaningfully take place without justice, reconciliation is unattainable without transforming root causes and sources of domination, and in some cases dismantling those systems of oppression. And as Dr. Williams brought up, this notion of reconciliation being among equals, how do we even come to terms with introducing a concept such as reconciliation with such massive power asymmetries, with such massive economic asymmetries in our social relations from settler states towards indigenous peoples? Once a path is charted, though, with an attention and a commitment toward examining truth in past injustices, truth in history, examining a commitment, charting a path towards justice and accountability, and moving toward healing, can a process of restoration be truly transformative? And I would invite us to move towards that notion of transformative justice, how root causes and oppressive conditions can transform social relations. Centering a focus on addressing root causes and comprehensive outcomes, transformative justice seeks to change inequity and power abuses within society as well as those personally involved. The notion of transformative justice recognizes the need for survivor safety, healing and agency, but also collective accountability and the transformation of the social conditions that perpetuate violence. Collectively, the interplay of truth, healing, and transformative justice are necessary to meaningfully invite the possibilities of reconciliation. The concept of reconciliation is a profound one. It's truly a powerful one. It invites the coming together of two groups with the intent to resolve injustices, crimes, conflicts. It is not a destination, but a possible framework requiring a deliberate intent to repair that has been harmed, an examination of those roots, and an ongoing vigilance to ensure such restoration. Reconciliation as a justice framework is a really ambitious one. It's often ambiguous in its premise, whose aims are threatened if approached superficially or without regard to systemic root causes. Truth and reconciliation commissions around the world, each in their own way, have forged a chartable path of intentions, some more successful than others. The experiences of these past commissions inform us that reconciliation cannot be an initial aim of resolving historical trauma. But it can be helpful if seen as a reflexive framework to work toward. They remind us of a central issue and guiding ethos that these processes are all faced with. Reconciliation often finds itself subsumed under efforts of charity and saviorism, serving to evasively maneuver from guilt and disarm its impact. A sort of settler move to innocence. Scholars Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang state specifically, quote, "Those strategies or positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings or of guilt or responsibility without giving up land or power or privilege, without having much to change, much at all, are examples of settler moves to innocence." So I invite us to sit with that discomfort, because as we sit with those intentions, right? Good intentions are not always all they're made up to be. Often decentering ourselves and inviting those impacted, truly impacted, to lead processes that can move us towards a transformative new reality are often the answer. I think spaces that are prepared in this way, that walk a path toward reconciliation, though they do not seek reconciliation, they seek restoration. Reconciliation may be possible, but it is dependent on how we tend to these crucial moments that require attention to truth, justice, accountability. consistent demands for the following continue to be made by generations of Native people that have been afflicted by the traumatic legacy of Indian boarding schools in the United States. Access to boarding school documents in church, government, and private archives and collections. This is something that religious leadership could step into immediately. The examination of the location of children in marked and unmarked graves at boarding school facilities, such as ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other geophysical methods. This is an example of an effort that we believe should be led by Native people, but can be supported by non-Native people. These types of efforts require large amounts of resources and funding. Funding that often has to be decided whether or not to build water and power infrastructure for tribal nations or to find out where their relatives are buried. Funding these efforts is a responsibility of complicit actors, allowing Native people to lead. The opportunity for survivors to offer testimony in culturally appropriate public hearings. Again, this may not be an area where religious leadership ought to lead, but can be certainly a part of this process to heal, to contribute to healing in a way of hearing. The restoration of language, culture, lifeways, and land. Accountability of those who committed crimes or covered up crimes. And the right and resources to direct one's own healing utilizing indigenous or Western healing methods. Though this is not an exhaustive list, and it's something that we could spend all day talking about, each of these elements requires a general overview that require time and resources. A Truth and Healing Commission in the United States would not solve all of these problems, but it would be a profound start. A start that the United States is barely initiating and scratching the surface with. So we invite you to support this process. We invite you to be active. We invite you to support in funding and advocacy, in leadership. And we hope to be able to walk with you on this path towards restoration, this path towards transforming our relations with one another as relatives. So with that, Tlaso Kamati, I look forward to our discussion.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Professor Torres. I will remind you that you have index cards on your tables. These are for questions which the organizers will bring to me to be able to share with the speaker. So if you have questions, you can begin to compile those. I'd like to now invite Monique Maddox to offer her comments.
Thank you all for inviting me today. My name is Monique Maddox. I am the board chair and CEO of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. This is a partnership between Descendants of Jesuit Enslavement and the Jesuit Conference of the United States. We are descendants, living descendants. As was mentioned earlier, in 2015, we learned as closely as possible the relationship of our families back to slavery. We have been afforded an opportunity to expound and expose that which has been a harm to our families. I grew up in Louisiana in a place where our family was transported, sold, split, torn apart from the present-day Virginia, present-day Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, the East Coast, if you will, and taken forcibly with rosary beads, prayed over as we were loaded onto ships and sent to Louisiana. And that is how my family got to Louisiana. I grew up in a place where our church was very segregated. It was divided down the aisle. We worshiped together with blacks on one side of the church and whites on the other side of the church. We had a grateful pastor who came in and said, "Why are we not harmonizing? Why are we this way? Why does your cemetery look the way that it does?" We had a profound moment of what to do. And in 2015, when the New York Times article broke about Georgetown's role in the slavery and saving its institution, we took it upon ourselves to say, here we are not gone, we have not perished. We are the living descendants. And now there are more than 15,000 of us that have been identified through our DNA and through our ancestry to say, we are here, do not overlook us. You can't do anything without us. And so as descendants, we went to the Jesuits. We went to those who harmed our families. And we said, you taught us this faith. You taught us this religion. You brought this religion to America in 1634 on the Ark and Dove in Maryland. You brought the first archbishop. What are you going to do? You can't name how you're going to provide justice for our families. You can't buy us. We're not going away. We're here to stay, we're here to speak, and we want to be the person, the people who are naming how we're going to be satisfied. And it's not money, it's love. We come to you in the church as you have taught us. Let's reconcile our differences. And so today, as we peel back, what does reconciliation mean? One of our big pillars is on truth-telling. As I mentioned, our name is the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation. So we begin in truth before we get to reconciliation. We want to tell our story, and we're here to tell our story. Most recently this year, Rachel Swarns wrote a book, The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved to Save America. That's our family. That's this foundation. This foundation is here to provide a comfort for descendants as well as to heal America. So yes, it's not just a truth council for America. Those things are really hard. America has never paid Black people for the enslavement that has been caused. And so we came to say, here's a foundation we want to support our descendants. The Jesuits prayed over our families and struggled, if you will, through how do we tear apart families and care for the elderly and infirm. And so we have one of our pillars to be to care for those emergency needs of the elderly and infirm. The other is to help our descendants through educational aspirations. We know that we have a big wealth gap. We have a big racial equity gap in this country. And so one of the ways we want to help with that is through providing educational scholarships for descendants. And that's not just to go to Jesuit institutions. It's to go to whatever institutions we want to go to. It's our decision. You don't get to tell us how we spend the money in our foundation. You don't get to name those things that you want to call justice. And then the last pillar of our foundation is around racial healing, truth-telling, and transformation. That's a long journey. That's something we're going to work on probably for the rest of our lives. However, this billion-dollar foundation, we would like it to be able to be here for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and all beyond. So thank you. I look forward to hearing your questions today.
Finally, Reverend Fopp.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege and an honor to share some thoughts with you here today. I want to share an experience that I had, and I face these questions as a man of the Christian faith and someone who looks to what is it that our Lord Jesus Christ invites us to bring to these conversations, something that has arisen throughout our discussions thus far. After the killing of George Floyd here, the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, I asked those entrusted to my pastoral care, to the best of their ability, to encounter someone, to speak to someone racially different from them, particularly people of color, to ask them, how did the killing of George Floyd make you feel? Not what you thought about it, but how did it make you feel? And I got various reports back from people who accepted that challenge, but there was one encounter between two women, a Caucasian woman and an African American woman. The Caucasian woman had accepted my challenge to speak to someone different from her, and she did. And these two women began talking about their teenage sons, who both were getting their driver's licenses. And the Caucasian lady said she was speaking about how much freer her life would be, how she was looking forward to not having to ferry her son from one place to the next, that she would have so much more time. And she said, and the lady to whom I was speaking very patiently listened to me. And then she said, and then I asked her, well, what about you? What about your son? And she said, the African-American mother said, well, I'm so delighted to hear what you've said, but I am absolutely terrified that my son will begin driving because I don't know what's going to happen. What happens in his encounters with the police or with others. Here's the point. The Caucasian lady said, Bishop, at that point, I understood. I had greater insight. One mother to another mother. I understood her fear for her child. And I understood, and I know what that is like. And I want to say, I think that was an occasion between those two women where really heart spoke to heart. And one was open to listening and open to dialogue and open to understanding. And I think part of it is precisely that. Because if you look at sacred scripture, the heart really is a symbol for the whole person. God says very often, I want their hearts. God wants his people. He wants them in their totality. And one of the things I think that the church brings to these conversations, even though the church enters these conversations with great humility, with great embarrassment even, that is at the very beginning of Open Wide Our Hearts. It is only with great humility that the church can engage in these conversations. But I think that whole notion of a conversion of heart to understanding, and Jesus encountered people one-on-one and brought them to deeper understanding and to conversion. That's at the very, very center of Open Wide Our Hearts and is captured even in the title. I think one step towards reconciliation or forgiveness or healing or restorative justice, a very important step, is the conversion of the heart at each and every person, first and foremost, to understand what has happened, to know it and to understand it as that mother said, I understood. I understood. And with great respect and knowing that there is a lot that we have to do in the realm of laws and things of that nature, civil rights, things of that nature, I do think one of the things that the church brings to our efforts is a recognition that laws will not get us to where we want to be. They're very, very important. But I do think it's a conversion of heart so that we do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. Where we do see one another as equal. I remember the gospel passage a few Sundays ago with the parable of the workers in the vineyard, and I know that there are many ways that that parable can be interpreted. But for me, at the end of the parable, where those hired first in the day, they don't say, you have paid them the same amount as us. They say, what? You have made them equal to us. It's a question, I think, of their basic human dignity. And the fact is, we really are all equal to one another. So it's with great, great humility that the church does enter into these conversations. But I do think part of it is the conversion of hearts that will get us to being the people that Christ calls us to be, ever more faithful to that journey, ever more faithful to accepting the challenge of doing that, and recognizing that it's about something deeper. It's about the human heart, and recognizing that, and in our efforts, remembering and seeking to convert hearts as well. So I thank you very much.
We have a number of questions, some great questions, some provocative questions. I thought it would be hard to match that incredible panel from last evening, but I think some of these questions have matched them. Just want to remind folks, if you have additional questions, please make sure that you fill out one of these cards, and they'll get it up here so that I can share it with the panel. First question is for you, Monique Maddox. Does your family use African ancestry services to track the DNA of your descendants? What role does technology and DNA play in that process?
We have a Descendants Association that was formed after the 2015 article by Rachel Swarns in the New York Times. Ancestry has played a role in that. The Catholic Church has played a role in that. As you all know, we have very good records. It was really easy for me to read that article and say, Jackson Hawkins, that is my great-great-grandfather, 3 years old on that slave ship. Gabe Butler, that's my great-great-grandfather, 10 years old on that slave ship. I had the benefit of my mother and her sisters being around and to say, that's my grandfather. That's my Aunt Nan. That's my Aunt Susan. So yes, for those outside of my immediate family, those who are a little more distant, who didn't just go to Maringouin, Louisiana, or to Ascension Parish, or to the Houma Thibodeau area of Louisiana, it may have been a little more difficult. And so DNA has definitely played a role. The Georgetown Memory Project was formed by a Georgetown alumni in 2015. His name is Richard Cellini, and Richard had led a nonprofit that afforded genealogists the opportunity to begin to unpeel all of these mysteries around these descendants. And so that project is still ongoing. That information is now with the American Ancestors Society. You can find it there, gu272.americanancestors.org, and you can see this history that's there that has been tied together through ancestry.
Thank you, Monique. We have a couple of questions about Open Wide Our Hearts, and I'm going to combine these and make this available to the panel as a whole. So the question is, what is the history of the authorship of Open Wide Our Hearts? Who is our in that Open Wide Our Hearts, and why did it not name the reality of white supremacy and white privilege explicitly?
The origin of Open Wide Our Hearts goes all the way back to the death of Michael Brown in St. Louis. At that time, I was chair of the African American Affairs Subcommittee. And the subcommittee at that time lifted up to the USCCB that we sensed something was going on in race relations. And we thought that there needed to be a new pastoral letter on racism, that it needed to be a full, a document of the full body of bishops. In 2017, while Open Wide Our Hearts was being drafted, Charlottesville happened, and the bishops established the ad hoc committee on racism, and part of its mandate would be to implement the pastoral letter on racism. So the pastoral letter's origin goes back to really the death of Michael Brown in St. Louis and a desire to respond to what was going on in the country at that time. And then
Final part was, why did it not name the reality of white supremacy and white privilege?
Right. That's, I think because Open Wide Our Hearts, the vision was an attempt to make something available to someone who might for the first time be wading into these waters and wanting to pick up a document and read it. And those are, I don't deny them, but I think that those are concepts that one comes to understand over time. And so that was, I think, why it was not included. I mean, because I think it was appealing to people who may just be wading into these for the first time. I hope in the future that the church will issue other documents on racism, and maybe as we seek to implement this at that time in the future, it could be included. That was, I think, the thinking of why not.
Let me ask a follow-up to that, because it's a theme that's emerging in the questions, and I think it's something all of you touched on in your presentations. And Father, I think you named something around a sensitivity here. There's a line. Some people are ready for this level of conversation, and then some people you have to walk through. It's like baby steps to get to a place to even acknowledge some of the hard truths that Professor Torres and Ms. Maddox and yourself talked about. How do we navigate that? And that's a question for the panel. How do you navigate that?
I think first and foremost, as you don't back away from it. I think I think a lot of it involves listening, and I think it's first to acknowledge the person where they are. Not that you can't challenge them and call them to conversion, but I think as we accompany them, we acknowledge where they are, listen to them, and then share with them and challenge them to growth and to come to further understanding. I go back to, the mother who, at least as a mother, understood. That's an opening point for further conversation and to draw her into it. So I think you first acknowledge that it has to be done and seize those opportunities to do that one-on-one or with groups. So that would be my response.
Thank you. Monique?
Thank you. I'll just respond quickly. We'll do my best to be concise, but I'm much less studied on the Open Wide Our Hearts development of the drafting and the history behind it from a fundamental standpoint. But my understanding of this neglect of naming white supremacy and including it as a central formation for where we are in our current society, as well as its connection, its fundamental connection to faith community and religious leadership, is I think a document like this very much speaks to serving as a barometer of where we are in the social, cultural, and political consciousness of race relations, of the understanding and interpretation of white supremacy and how it is, and its various implications, historical and contemporary, to our current society. I think it's important to be reminded that one of the reasons why we are in the place we are today and feeling like there's so much work to do is I think that there has been a very stubborn and persistent lack of addressing of these concepts for generations. There is a series of concentric economic and power structures that have benefited from white supremacy, that have not been moved to address it historically. So in order to address the reality that the dominant holding society, let's call it in the West, but in the United States for our experience, right? There has been not this desire to move to change because there is too much to give up. And so as I want to connect this back to sort of this, what Dr. Williams brought up is this notion of innocence, and then what I brought up as the settler move to innocence. I think it's tied here, where when we have conversations like naming and centering white supremacy, and the need to decenter it, to decenter whiteness, and the power connections that it holds, there is always something that must be given up. And that's power, that's privilege, that's resources. And those are necessary elements. And I appreciate the Archbishop's mention of the conversion of heart, because I think that's an enormous part of this, right? We also have to be reminded that it was the legal system that allowed for many of these injustices to happen. And so while one law or commission is not going to transform the social conditions that we want to see in our future, that we want to work towards reconciliation, that we want to restore these relationships, that we need to chart that path to identify where we are. How do we even meet people? How do we know where we are if we're not brave enough to have those conversations and to name concepts like white supremacy in the first place? So I appreciate that conversation because it's one that bridges, of course, I think the theological, the social, the political apparatuses that very much need to be in alignment.
If I could, I would add that white supremacy is only one group. As a Black person, we've been harmed by many different groups of people. So to single out and say, why is white supremacy not named? As a Black person, I would say there are many other groups that can be named if we look back historically as well.
This is such a fascinating conversation on so many different levels. I want to underscore something here too. I'd ask you to think about this in the context of history in this way. when Professor Torres talks about government complicity, William Pratt, who I mentioned, who was on that Nebraska.org website, convinced the federal government in the pursuit of Indian schools to provide abandoned military installations, which became the foundation for the creation of those schools. So there's this relationship that he's naming where white supremacy is then carried from the church into the secular, into the education, into the fabric of the society itself. So that process of disentangling is important. Having said that, I also want to point out to you, I spent a lot of time talking about 1963. Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, I think, speaks precisely to what Archbishop Fobb is talking about in this sense. King is writing to the clergy in Montgomery who have come out against the march and said, hey, can you slow down? Your actions are unwise and untimely. And I think Open Our Hearts in that moment was saying, we don't want to be on the wrong side of this conversation in terms of being the folks who say it's unwise and untimely to talk about what's happening in Ferguson. And yet at the same time, we recognize there are a lot of people who feel like what's happening in Ferguson is unwise and untimely. Follow me here? Real talk. I should have said in the preface to this question, asking for a friend, because I grapple with this a lot of times, is that you find people who don't want to hear about white fragility, don't want to hear anything about Ibram Kendi, are triggered by certain names and certain concepts. And yet, I always say to folks, and this is very true, and I think Open Our Hearts is a good example, certainly the writings of Pope Francis, or my favorite, Pedro Arrupe, allow us a conduit within the Catholic Church to speak specifically to issues of racial justice where I never have to go out of the fold, but people have to be comfortable enough to be uncomfortable in dealing with what Arrupe says when he talks about privilege in 1973 in Valencia, Spain, and he goes, all of us have privilege, and all of us have to be willing to, in a way that Professor Torres talked about it, give some of it up. I don't have to do it with Robin DiAngelo, but you still got to be uncomfortable. Dr. Maddox, you have a great question here. You said something in your presentation along these lines. We want to be the people naming how we will be satisfied. It's not money, it's love. How did your community come together to name this? What would you say is the currency of reconciliation? Why do you want the love of Jesuits when you could have written them off a long time ago? I'm going to ask the hard questions.
And as you said, we can't shy away from uncomfortable moments. So as a descendant, I will say that it is uncomfortable. Not all descendants agree with this foundation. Not all Jesuits agree with this foundation. Not all Catholics agree. I meet many Catholics who are apprehensive about, what are you doing? What does this mean? How will this affect me is what they're really getting to. And so when we talk about naming the currency, Jesus taught us to forgive. He died on that cross for forgiveness. We come in love to forgive. And at the same time, we say, we want to be able to be self-supporting. We want to uplift the people that have been harmed. These descendants, our family members have been harmed. Some of you may be descendants and you don't know it yet. We have been harmed. We have been perpetually harmed as a people, as a Black people in America and all over the world and many other places. And so this foundation is here to be able to provide, as I mentioned, the educational uplift of people so that you can be self-sufficient. That is the currency. It is to be able to be self-sufficiency. We want to be able to satisfy our own needs in the way that we want it. What does that look like? It may be not going to Georgetown University. It may be not going to whatever other Jesuit institution there is out there. Jesuits are very good educators. Their mission is social justice and education. And so we said, here we are. Here's your platform. Get behind us. And so we came to say, let's join in arms and let's be a model for what this could look like.
Thank you. Professor Torres, I have a very long question for you in multiple parts. And by the way, I so enjoyed getting to know your work. I'm really appreciative of everything that you bring to the table. But I'm going to try to ask this question in a way, and feel free to tackle it in any way that you like. For nearly 2 centuries, the federal government, the Catholic Church, and at least 12 other Christian denominations operated boarding school institutions designed to wield education as a means of assimilating Native children into settler culture by stripping them of their language, values, cultural, and spiritual practices, often violently. The history and impacts of the U.S. Indian boarding schools have largely been written out of history books and continues to be left out of the American social, cultural, and political consciousness outside of Native communities and tribal nations. Since 2012, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has been seeking to change that with their mission to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma created by the U.S. Indian boarding schools. From the Healing Coalition's perspective, what are the essential considerations to center for a society that has just barely begun to acknowledge the history and impacts to Native people?
There's a thesis in there somewhere, I think. It starts with, I think, as so much has been shared with today, to listen to Indigenous people and to be willing to act when asked to. We can, of course, do all the listening, all the learning, feel like we are moved to change. But if we are not moved to act, we are siding with status quo relations. We are not merely talking about historical impacts. We are talking about how settler colonialism, utilizing the vehicle of education of Indian boarding schools, how that has tremendously transformed the social, economic, cultural, and political power, apparatus, whatever we want to call it. Those spheres of influence have been dramatically shifted. And we are still seeing the impacts. As I mentioned previously, when tribal nations are having to decide whether or not to earmark appropriations to make sure that there is clean running water for their people, or to find out where their relatives are buried at boarding schools. It resembles a reality that because tribal nations are having to interface with these questions at all, an environment that does not have clean running water or electricity. We hear so much in the public sphere, in the public domain, about the poverty context of tribal nations in the United States, in Canada, First Nations in Canada. But almost every single time, it falls short and stops of the context of settler colonialism, recognizing why these conditions are that way in the first place. Stolen land, stolen bodies, stolen children. And stolen children are still happening today with the child removal and child welfare crises that we're continuing to see, despite the Indian Child Welfare Act. We were relieved that ICWA was upheld this summer. We were not so sure that was going to happen, but we were relieved that occurred and that the Supreme Court was at least able to see that this is a unique sovereignty issue. So there's so much to be said about this question, and I'll try to keep it brief, because fundamentally we need to be able to be moved to act. Again, even if it requires us to be in those spaces of vulnerability, of humility, as the Archbishop mentioned. A lot of folks, particularly in leadership, are concerned about, well, what happens if boarding school records and archival documents are released to tribes, descendants, the general public? Should we be prepared for further lawsuits? I would say that that is a question that we're asking too soon. Why are we not caring for those individuals that were greatly impacted by the physical, sexual, psychological, and spiritual abuse? Why are we not concerned for them first?
Simple question, loaded question, hard question. I'm going to enjoy the answers to this. But I'm going to preface it in saying it this way. I watched when Minneapolis, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, when the urban unrest started in this community. I remember walking up to Fort Snelling and watching Minneapolis burn from Fort Snelling and being overcome by the irony of standing in a place of trauma, witnessing a trauma, and trying to reconcile the historical trauma with the reality of what was happening in this place. Here I am looking at the marker to the executed, martyred Native leaders, thinking about the history of Fort Snelling and its relationship to settler colonialism and to American chattel slavery, and then watching the fruition in our contemporary moment of our inability to deal with those things manifest itself in the burning of buildings in our community. Here's the question. We'll start with you, Archbishop. Should the U.S. have a nationwide Truth and Reconciliation Commission of some kind?
I think that that it would provide an opportunity for listening, for healing. I think it would provide an opportunity for encounter and accompaniment. So I don't know why not. I mean, I think it fits in basically with Catholic moral teaching to hear the harms and listen to one another. Pope Francis's basic notion of encounter. And, you know, I go back, that was a moment for me where the mother said, I understood. And I don't think we can ever listen too much. And I think, for me, the definition of listening, as I once heard, is to listen with the knowledge that I might be changed by what I hear. So from that perspective, that this commission would listen and maybe we might be changed by what we hear, I would see it as a way forward.
I do believe we should have a commission. I think that would be a great thing to have. My question then would be, after you name it, after you do it, how will it impact your life? What is the next step? What is the action going to be taken? And for how long? Will we forget about it after 3 years? Or will we continue down the path of trying to transform and heal this country?
I very much am in agreement. I think one of the reasons why we so profoundly need a conversation of this magnitude, followed by, Monique, as you mentioned, sort of a chartable path of recommendations and steps for action, is that Black, brown, Native, Indigenous, people of color, subaltern communities in the United States, for so long, their experiences have become invisibilized by institutions and structures of power. And that's precisely why so many took to the streets. That's precisely why Minneapolis and many other cities around the globe, not just the United States, showed their actions, demonstrated violence, demonstrated that because we have been silenced for so long. This is by no means saying that violence is the answer, right? But understanding where that violence and that response comes from I think is important. I believe it was Martin Luther King Jr. that said that a riot is the language of the unheard. And just a few short days after the murder of George Floyd, I went to the streets to be with my neighbors, to, as Archbishop said, to ask, what is our experience? What is our common experience? What is your experience? How are they different? With my Mexica relatives, we brought our medicine of dance, of song, to the streets when there was so much raw anger and energy, because there was no other platform to that point where our voices were being heard, were being channeled, where that energy was being channeled. So we offered our medicine, we offered our dance, we offered our song. People were literally moved. They moved out of the way to make space for that ceremony. We held ceremony on the streets. So what was seen on the news, what was seen on CNN, on MSNBC, on Fox News, was not that. You could not see that on the news. They decided that that was not something to be shown. A commission would be something that would provoke those encounters, allow for substantive dialogue to happen, for us to remember our relations, to remember our connections as relatives.
Those answers. You guys took a long time to warm up, and now I have a million questions. Thank you for that. You wait till the last 10 minutes, and you give me all these great questions. This one is for the panel, and I think appropriate. We continue to hear about the limitations of restorative justice and a need for transformative justice. What are we aiming to restore with historical harms and racial justice? What role does racial justice play on the road to transformative justice?
Sure. Racial justice is only one aspect of transforming America. The race conversation is one that is so deep in this country. We tend to center a lot of things back to that. And so that is what I believe is the reason why we always talk about racial injustice. It is one way of naming the harms to people. And so I believe that racial injustice is one way that we could begin to restore our faith in humanity, our faith in one another, our faith in people, our faith in God. We can't be equal if we're not all treated equally. There will be no equal if we're not treated equally, racially, whether that is through dollars, whether that is through programs, we need to be treated equally.
Thank you. Yes, I think restorative justice is absolutely essential to how we address the social, economic, and political injustices and inequities that we're seeing in our contemporary moment. I think the limitations that are being brought up generally emerge as a result of the misalignment of the aims of restorative justice and the commitment of institutions who are attempting to wield restorative justice principles. And there we see an unsuccessful implementation of it. Because the United States historically and contemporaneously resembles and reflects the reality of a nation that was formed on stolen land, on the backs of stolen people, an economy built entirely off of that reality, a political structure built entirely off of that reality. We have to be able to have the courage to recognize that certain economic privileges and power, certain political privileges and power continue to be shaped by that historical reality. And I'll just say one thing further, that until we fully embrace the principles of restorative justice, which are to grasp the root of how those conditions are even brought about in the first place, then what is being wielded is not restorative justice. It is more punitive, following the footsteps of punitive justice, which is something that has been weaponized by dominant society for such a long time that it often becomes that status quo tool that continues to be felt by subaltern bodies and people, communities and nations. And so I think fundamentally that's where we have to grapple with. Racism is an extension of that, and it's often how we communicate those differences in power and difference. But that fundamental notion of settler colonialism being sort of how this nation was even formed is something that we need to be doing a lot better job at. And the current struggles in school boards and curricular developments around this need for and this desire for having a patriotic curriculum instead of a curriculum of truth is really troubling, because we are continuing to walk down that path of cultural amnesia, and that cultural amnesia benefits only those that are still unwilling to leverage their power, their privilege, the resources, and the willingness to lean into heavy and hard conversations to open our circle as human relatives.
Very quickly, I think, if you go, again, spiritually and theologically, that the whole notion of conversion involves a lot. It's a total turning around of one's understanding, a total conversion of one's life. So I would say, yes, that if we're going to change the hearts of people, and then people change things, I would hope that that would be an ongoing conversion and a struggle with conversion with regard to everything that might need to be changed. So.
Thank you, Father. We have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one last question. I want to remind the participants and those at home that if you would like to continue this dialogue, certainly there's a breakout session, but you're able to engage with folks on the app to ask additional questions of panelists. And certainly, I believe everyone will be available after this session. Last question is interesting, very, very interesting, and it dovetails with what you just shared, Father. What is the role of those who are not privileged in the context of improving racial justice? I am speaking in the context of those who are experiencing racism, don't have generational wealth, and are just trying to get by. But this also applies to those in the dominant white culture. It's for the panel. I just wanted all of you to sit there and look uncomfortable for a moment.
I'll jump. And thank you for naming that, because I think the discomfort comes from the fact that that is such a huge question. And it's a question that I think, and I mean this respectfully, I think comes from a place of privilege. Because those that are, the role and the role of those that are oppressed or that are feeling the burden of settler colonialism, of white supremacy, those that bear the scars and the obstacles of historical trauma, of intergenerational trauma, have the right to exist without needing to have a designated role in how we restore things. And so I'm gonna try to conceptualize this question in more of a generalized sense of what, instead of thinking of it perhaps as expectation, more as perceived, maybe passive role. And I think that is the right to exist and the right to be restored. Nothing further. Certainly, there will be those that engage the courage to share their stories and their lived experiences and their testimonies. That is also an excessive and undue burden. In the work of the Healing Coalition, we hear from boarding school survivors on a daily basis. Every time a story is shared with us, there is a deep offering, an offering that they know that they are making, that when we accept those stories, we make a commitment to fight for them, to love them, to honor them, and to advocate for them. I have no expectation for anyone who has been traumatized by the government, by the Catholic Church, by the Jesuits, by Christianity, that they have a responsibility to tell their story. Absolutely not. They hold the right, deserve the right to be able to exist and to be in a space to be able to be restored. It is, at the Healing Coalition, I would consider us to be warriors in this struggle. A group of Native people who have strong, courageous Native people who have committed to be able to do this work, which also carries a burden. But non-Native folks, religious leadership, faith communities, there is a lot to be done that can be done. And for those that are willing to speak up, that have been oppressed, that continue to be oppressed, we need to do that. We need to do so, to do that work in gratitude for them sharing their stories, and then a commitment to be able to respond and to act.
I'm going to jump in there very quickly and just share this because it's an interesting question. I mentioned Pedro Arrupe earlier, 1973, Valencia, Spain, Men and Women for Others. Arrupe says something in that which I think is a challenge to all of us because he reminds us that all of us have, to a certain degree, privilege. We may not recognize it as privilege, and I think it comes down to the story that Father Fob shared with us. I'm going to give you a good example. The March on Washington in 1963, women are not included. So there are women on the planning committee, but then you have to have Pauli Murray write A. Philip Randolph and say, I don't think that it's right that we're having this national march on Washington for jobs and freedom and not a single woman is represented. You're simply setting us up to have to come back here in 10 years and do this again because you didn't, address this evil. I think that in the same sense, when we recognize whatever little privilege we have, that should make us more sensitive and more open to understanding the larger work of dismantling privilege altogether. I, as a black male man of color, know the sting of racism. I don't know the double bonds, the intersectionality of what black women experience. And so my male privilege and dominance that I have in society in those areas should give me greater sensitivity over those who are experiencing it in other ways, should make me more sensitive, should make me an even greater warrior, should put me even more in the fight because I've got the privilege of understanding what it feels like to be discriminated against. There's real power in that. It's the naming, it's the sharing, it's the advocacy. Please thank please thank this amazing panel. Father Fob, Mr. Torres, Ms. Maddox, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, these sessions are all being recorded. They will be available after the conference. At 10:45, the breakout sessions begin. If you're a presenter, please go to the room now. Perhaps you've heard our students changing classes upstairs. You're about to join them. When classes open out, the tech team knows to bring the volume up. I don't know if you noticed that or not. If we could wrap up the breakout sessions at around 11:55, so anyone interested in noon mass can join us down here in the chapel. So thank you, and thank you.